They arrived in Kansas, under a dry July sun in 1943, the first transport of German prisoners stepping off the train into the heart of America. At 1700 hours, the mess hall doors swung open. Sergeant Wilhelm Müller, of the 21st Panzer Division captured at Kasserine Pass, froze 3 meters from the serving line. What he saw looked unreal, like something from a propaganda photo, gleaming metal trays, each stacked with a thick slice of pot roast, mashed potatoes, smooth as cream, 60 grams of green beans, 2 warm dinner, rolls a small cup of real butter, and a slice of apple pie that smelled of cinnamon. For 6 days, they'd survived on watery cabbage soup. Before capture in North Africa, a good week meant 300 grams of coarse bread, a scrap of ersatz meat, and a thumb of fat about 200 calories. Here, American soldiers ate over 3,000 a day. The prisoners ate in silence, heads down, working methodically through each bite, like men performing a ritual. When Müller finished, he folded his napkin over 2 remaining pieces of bread and tucked them into his shirt. Around him, hundreds did the same. Pockets bulged with rolls, apple cores half-filled buttercups, as if hunger itself had learned to hide. Through the kitchen window, a young American private whispered, "Should we clear the tables?" Lieutenant Howard Chen, the mess officer, shook his head. "No," he said. "Let them learn." His duty log for the day, later, carried the same words. Morning inspection told the story. Bread hardened under bunks. Butter melted through uniform pockets. One Luftwaffe lieutenant, shot down over Sicily, had wrapped 4 rolls inside his pillowcase. Questioned, he explained simply, "For when the food stops." He didn't know that under the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners of war had to be fed the same as the captor's own troops. It was a rule written in dry legal language, but in 1943, America, it meant flour, beef, sugar, and dairy, in amounts the Germans could hardly imagine. The abundance came from an engine that never stopped Kansas mills running 3 shifts wheat trains, rolling day and night cattle fattened on government-subsidized feed. These men, once soldiers now sat before trays, meant for officers. But trust didn't come from promises. It came from repetition. Day 2, the same meal. Day 3, the same again. In his diary written in broken English, learned from the guards, Müller noted eggs again. Not mistake. He ate 6 slices of toast and 3 cups of coffee before vomiting behind the latrine. His body rebelled against the feast his mind could not yet believe. And so the lesson began, the long, slow education in what it meant to have enough. Every evening at 1700 hours, the clatter of spoons against steel trays became the sound of a new kind of war one fought, not with bullets, but with abundance. If you're still here, I'd love to know who's watching. Share your name and where you're from in the comments, your city, your country. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Let's keep history alive together, one story at a time. By the end of that first week, abundance had turned into sickness. The camp medical log at Concordia recorded 43 cases of vomiting cramps and fever men whose starved bodies couldn't handle the sudden flood of fat and protein. Doctors called it refeeding shock, though most guards just called it the butter sickness. These soldiers had lived months on the edge of famine. Now their bodies rebelled against plenty. Inspections revealed the deeper cause: fear. Beneath mattresses and floorboards, guards found bread crusts, bacon, wrapped in newspaper, even apples buried in the dirt near the motor pool. One hidden pit held 87 rolls and 23 half-eaten steaks, already turning gray. The discovery led Colonel Paul Neufeld, the camp commandant, to call an emergency meeting with the Prisoner Liaison Committee. Through an interpreter, he told them, "The food supply is permanent." The spokesman asked, "How long is permanent?" The colonel replied, "Indefinite." The man frowned. What does indefinite mean? The meeting ended there. Silence was safer than hope. Hoarding wasn't defiance. It was instinct, the muscle memory of starvation. Psychologists today would call it a survival adaptation. In 1943, It looked like madness, men sneaking butter under their shirts, eating in the dark, so no one would take their share. At night, guards could hear wrappers crinkling softly, like the sound of mice in the walls. Still, the meals continued: eggs, bacon, coffee, orange juice, the same every morning. Mueller wrote in his diary, "They give eggs again. Maybe mistake, but no everyday eggs." He tried to pace himself, but hunger had become a reflex. He ate until his stomach cramped, until his body purged the excess. And yet by the next day, he would do it again. Lieutenant Chen's kitchen staff watched through the window, half amused, half pitying. One cook from Chicago noted in a letter home, "They act like the food will vanish if they blink." In truth, for most of them, it once had. On the Eastern Front, in the desert and bombed-out towns, food was a rumor that could disappear with the next air raid. By July 8th, Camp Security discovered a small network trading extra ration cigarettes and bread swapped like currency. Food became money, then faith. The prisoners didn't yet trust the promise of enough. That trust would take weeks to grow measured, not in words, but in calories. Every plate that stayed full through morning inspection was a tiny victory over the memory of hunger. And Concordia, with its endless trains of grain and beef rolling in from the Midwest, would teach that lesson the only way possible, one meal at a time. By the second and third weeks of July, something subtle began to change inside Camp Concordia. The meals kept coming identical in their quiet abundance: steak, potatoes, eggs, butter pie, until routine dulled disbelief. Hunger no longer drove the men's hands to pocket rolls or slip apples into their coats. The fear that ancient instinct whispering, "Save some, it might end tomorrow," slowly began to fade. Wilhelm Müller's diary shows the transformation almost day by day. July 14th, steak again. They not run out. July 18th, eggs every morning. Then on the 22nd, butter every meal. Maybe Kansas rich place only. He was right in part. Kansas in 1943 was bursting with prosperity: 252 million bushels of wheat, a record harvest, and nearly 4 million head of cattle grazing under the same endless sky that now watched over these German prisoners. Ellsworth Milling Company contracted to feed the camp, ran 3 shifts around the clock. In a nation mobilized for total war, the American Midwest had become an empire of plenty. The contrast was unimaginable for men who had marched through the ruins of Europe. In North Africa and on the Russian steppe, supply lines broke faster than fronts did. German rations had fallen to half or even a third of the planned allotment. Meat replaced by soy or turnip paste bread, stretched with sawdust and rye husks. At Concordia, butter was spread so thick it left fingerprints. The camp reports from early August noted a curious pattern: hoarding incidents declined sharply. Müller's entry from August 9th reads simply, "I leave bread on plate today. Mornings still come. Food still there." It was a small sentence, but for men who had measured survival in crumbs, it marked a profound shift, the rediscovery of trust through repetition. But not everyone could adapt. Gefreiter Hans Lehmann, of the 334th Infantry Division captured in Italy, never stopped hoarding. His records show food hidden under his mattress week after week. When confronted, he trembled, insisting, "When it stops, I will have something." The camp psychiatrist wrote, "Subject exhibits trauma response consistent with Leningrad survivors. Recommends observation, no punishment." For Lehmann, starvation was no longer a memory. It was part of his identity. Outside, the wire trains rumbled past carrying wheat, beef, corn, the raw muscle of American logistics. Inside, the prisoners began to change in quieter ways. Some laughed more easily. Others started leaving the mess hall without stuffing pockets. A few even turned down seconds. For the first time in years, their bodies were fed, but more than that, their minds were beginning to believe. In the heart of wartime Kansas, among fields of gold and the low hum of mills, the defeated army of a starving continent was learning a new vocabulary enough. By November 1943, abundance had turned into an irony that no one could have predicted. When the International Red Cross delegation arrived at Camp Concordia, the prisoners' representatives filed an unusual complaint. The portions were too large. Dr. Friedrich Baumann, a Swiss inspector who had toured over 40 POW camps across 3 continents, wrote in disbelief, "This is the first instance in which prisoners request smaller rations to avoid gaining weight." The average German prisoner at Concordia had put on nearly 8 kilograms since arrival. The camp records confirm it: procurement, steady food supply, unwavering. The men who had once buried bread under their bunks now left half their rolls untouched. For the American guards, it was a sign that the camp had found balance. For the Germans, it was something stranger, a confrontation with excess. Across the Atlantic, their homeland was starving. Allied bombings had gutted rail lines, cut farms from factories. In some cities, bread was stretched with turnip flour, and sawdust meat nearly vanished. Here in the middle of Kansas, every breakfast still came with eggs, bacon, coffee, and orange juice, the same, served to U.S. soldiers on base. But the story didn't end in Concordia. Across America, similar patterns emerged in Camp Alva, Oklahoma, Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, Hearne, Texas, and Ruston, Louisiana. The same shock, the same disbelief. At Alva, when 3,000 Afrika Korps veterans arrived from British custody, their average weight was barely 58 kilograms. The first meal brought chaos, 17 men hospitalized after eating too quickly. Years of deprivation had taught them that full plates were traps, illusions before the hunger returned. Some refused to believe the Americans' generosity was real. At Camp Chaffee, prisoners on kitchen duty saw U.S. cooks scraping pounds of uneaten food into waste bins each day. One German, Martin Schultz, convinced his barrack that this must be evidence of an impending shortage, the Americans destroying food to hide scarcity. But week after week, the waste continued, and no shortage came. By December, even Schultz had to admit the truth: they waste because they can. This is normal for them. That realization spread faster than any rumor. Major Friedrich Wolf, a German quartermaster among the prisoners, secretly calculated that the U.S. camp discarded nearly 20% of its food. To him, that wasn't inefficiency, it was proof of overwhelming capacity. His coded report, smuggled through Red Cross mail, reached Berlin in January 1944 and stunned his superiors. American supply exceeds frontline need by wide margin, it read. Waste indicates production surplus, not weakness. For the German prisoners, it was more than data, it was revelation. The true difference between the two sides wasn't courage or even tactics. It was calories. It was the quiet certainty that in this war, the side that could feed even its enemies like officers was already winning. By early 1944, that quiet realization had matured into something like respect, or perhaps awe. Inside, the barbed wire lessons in logistics began to circulate like contraband philosophy. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, a former instructor from the Wehrmacht Logistics School, Hauptmann Otto Brenner, organized clandestine seminars for fellow prisoners. His confiscated notes, preserved in camp archives, read like a lecture from a defeated empire. The American system operates on the principle of abundance. The German system on the principle of scarcity. Abundance permits waste, inefficient, but psychologically stable. Scarcity demands efficiency, optimal, but breeds fear and distrust. To the guards, these were idle musings. To the prisoners, they were revelation. The Americans, it seemed, had won the war before it began, not through genius generals or secret weapons, but through an economy so vast that waste itself was a sign of power. The idea spread quietly from camp to camp. The United States could fight on 4 continents and still feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. Outside, the machine of abundance roared on. The War Food Administration purchased every surplus bushel, guaranteeing prices that kept farms running day and night. Texas dairies, flush with milk they couldn't ship overseas, sold it all to government buyers. When Hearne Camp doubled its butter ration in July 1944, 4 pats per meal instead of 2, the prisoners panicked. To them, Excess meant collapse. Too much butter now, Gefreiter Paul Richter wrote in his diary. Sign of system breakdown. They distribute before spoilage. But August came, then September, and the butter kept flowing. The Americans weren't emptying warehouses. They were just drowning in production. Even the Red Cross observers noted the absurd imbalance. A German lieutenant captured at Anzio described his disbelief. At home, my wife writes, she stands 6 hours for bread. Here I cannot finish my plate. In Camp Indianola, Nebraska, another group of prisoners began charting calorie counts, trying to make sense of it. Their calculations showed daily intakes around 400 calories, including Sunday roasts. And still, the trains came. From Kansas wheat fields, from Texas cattle yards, from the corn plains of Iowa, food poured into the camps with military precision. To the Americans, it was simple arithmetic of supply and morale. To the Germans, it was metaphysics. Müller, in a later entry, tried to express it. They fight war with full stomach. Maybe that is secret. By 1944, every man behind the wire had learned the same truth in his own way. Logistics was destiny. A nation that could waste and not worry had already built victory into its economy. Every tray of butter, every slice of pie, every scrap tossed into a bin was proof of something larger than mercy. It was proof of invincibility. As 1945 approached, victory was already visible, not just in headlines, but in letters from home. The mail sensors at Camp Indianola and Opelika began intercepting the same kinds of messages, wives describing queues for bread that stretched down bombed streets, children dreaming of meat they hadn't tasted in months. In Hamburg, civilians lived on 200 calories a day, sometimes less. In Essen, bakeries used ground acorns and sawdust to stretch the flour. The men reading those letters in their clean Kansas barracks were eating 400 calories, double what their families survived on. The guilt hit harder than hunger ever had. Some prisoners, especially officers, started skipping meals as a form of penance. At Camp Opelika, Alabama, Major Wilhelm Langanger led a 2-day hunger strike after learning his wife and daughter were living on turnip soup. "We eat better as prisoners than our families at home," he told the interpreter. "This is not acceptable to German honor." The camp commandant, a practical man named Colonel James Dorsey, listened patiently before replying. "Your hunger won't fill their plates." His log recorded the order that followed: rations will continue per regulation. The strike ended after 40 hours. The food kept coming. That contrast, the starving homeland and the overfed captivity, carved deep cracks into the prisoner's sense of identity. Müller wrote, "They give us too much and we cannot give anything back." For men raised on the discipline of scarcity, this generosity was unbearable. It stripped them of the moral framework that once justified their struggle. If the enemy could feed you better than your own command ever did, what had you been fighting for? Some tried to make sense of it through superstition. Rumors spread that the endless food was an American trick, a way to soften them before re-education. Others saw it as proof of divine punishment, that Germany's suffering was payment for pride. But the longer they stayed, the more undeniable it became. Abundance was not a ruse, it was a system. At Camp Hearn, a few men began writing to the Red Cross begging that their extra food be redirected to German civilians. Regulations made that impossible. "We cannot send your leftovers home," the interpreter explained. "Food does not travel backward in war," the phrase stuck. Prisoners repeated it quietly among themselves, half in bitterness, half in awe. Food does not travel backward. And as winter turned toward the final spring of the war, the guilt hardened into understanding. America's power wasn't just measured in tanks or planes, it was measured in how much it could afford to waste. For the men behind barbed wire, that was the cruelest truth of all. They had lost not just a war of weapons, but a war of appetite. The war ended, not with a battle cry, but with the sound of cutlery on tin trays. In May 1945 at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, the prisoners were eating dinner when a guard announced that Germany had surrendered. Silence fell. Then somewhere near the back, A man laughed, short-cracked, half disbelief, half release. "We lost," he said in German, "and we eat like kings." The guards didn't reply. They didn't need to. The proof was in the plates. Over 17 months, the average Concordia prisoner had gained 14 kilograms. Their old uniforms, carefully folded since capture, no longer fit. The irony was visible in their body's flesh, where famine had once drawn bone. When repatriation began in 1946, thousands of these men passed through British and French transit camps in Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Antwerp. There, the abundance vanished overnight. Rations dropped back to European scarcity, thin soup bread, no meat. American doctors monitoring the transfers noted weight loss of more than a kilogram a week. Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a German physician working under Allied supervision, described it simply: their bodies remember abundance, but must relearn deprivation. Müller returned to Dusseldorf that August 68th, kilograms down from the 74 he'd reached in Kansas, but still heavier than when he'd been captured in Tunisia. His mother served him a meal of potato soup and bread with turnip jam. She apologized for its meagerness. Müller ate quietly, then said the only English phrase he ever spoke at home: "It is enough." That night, he wrote in his diary, "She does not know what enough means now. Neither do I." For years after the war, former POWs met at veterans' gatherings. They rarely talked about battles. They talked about food, about the butter, the coffee, the pie. One of them, Heinz Lehmann, the chronic hoarder from Concordia, never recovered. His 1951 psychiatric file from a Cologne hospital reads, "Patient suffers from persistent anxiety regarding food security, despite adequate supply. Reports intrusive dreams of American meals. Repeats phrase, 'They fed us better than we fed ourselves.'" Those 9 words became in time the war's quiet verdict. Germany had fought with efficiency, precision, and sacrifice, but the United States had fought with scale. Its factories never stopped, its fields never emptied, its soldiers never starved. By 1948, even the new West German Ministry of Economics cited POW testimony to study American supply models. Reports once dismissed as exaggeration were now confirmed by data. During 1943-45, U.S. agricultural output exceeded the combined Axis total by over 340%. The story of Concordia passed into legend, a symbol, a warning, a parable of calories and consequence. In the 1950s, the phrase Concordia rations appeared in Bundeswehr manuals as shorthand for logistical superiority. Lesson from 1943. One note read, "The enemy who feeds prisoners at 3,200 calories a day possesses reserves beyond our offensive reach." Decades later, when Wilhelm Müller gave his final interview to a Dusseldorf historian in 1998, he dismissed questions about combat. "You want to know about the war," he said. "I'll tell you about the war." On July 4th, 1943, I walked into an American mess hall and thought the tables were decorated. I had not seen that much food in 2 years. They gave me this every day for 700 days. We lost because they could do that. He died 4 months later. His diary rests today in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, under the file Kriegsgefangenschaft. Alltag der Gefangenen, prisoner of war, everyday life. At Concordia, the mess hall stood until 1963, when it was demolished to make room for new grain silos. Only one relic remains: a stainless steel tray, standard U.S. Army issue, its compartments still faintly etched with knife marks. The museum plaque beneath it reads, Camp Concordia, 1943-1946. They came as enemies and left understanding the distance between us. That distance wasn't measured in miles or even years. It was measured in buttergrams and steak ounces, in calories the prisoners couldn't comprehend, and waste they couldn't justify in the quiet arithmetic of a nation whose greatest weapon was its capacity to feed. The fighting had killed millions. The feeding revealed who could keep fighting forever. And the men of Concordia learned that lesson every evening at 1700 hours, one tray at a time, until enough became something they could finally believe in. What happened at Camp Concordia has always stayed with me, not because of the violence, but because of what it revealed. In a world at war, power wasn't only measured in weapons or victories, but in the simple act of being able to feed even your enemy. That to me says more about civilization than conquest ever could. If stories like this make you think a little deeper about what history really means, stay with me. Subscribe so we can keep uncovering the quiet truths hidden between the battles.